This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today in a kind of distant, remote COVID pandemic edition of the podcast is Chris Tropeano of Resonant Culture Brewing in Charlotte, North Carolina. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Hey, Jamie. Thanks for having me.
We've known Chris for a long time, and if you have been or checked out some of the all-access video classes produced by Craft Beer and Brewing, you may be familiar with Chris. He's done classes on advanced hopping with us and on kettle souring. We're going to talk a little bit about some of that later on because Chris has had some additional learning that he has experienced even since teaching those classes, but on both the kettle souring and on the dry hopping and hopping kind of strategies. We're going to kind of revisit some of those. We're going to talk about the lager program at Resonant Culture and some of the developments that they've been making on the lager side. We're going to talk a little bit about mixed culture as well. Before we do that, nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D chillers. Innovative modular designs and no proprietary parts propel G&D ahead as the premier choice for your glycol chilling needs. Breweries you recognize like Russian River, Ninkasi, Jack's Abbey, Samuel Adams, and more trust G&D to chill the beer you love. Call G&D Chillers to discuss your project today or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, this episode is brought to you by RAR North Star Pils, a new base malt to set your compass by. RAR North Star Pils is crafted for brewers looking for domestic Pilsner malt with low color and low modification. North Star Pils carries overtones of honey and sweet bread, supported by flavors and aromas of hay and nutty character, suitable for any beer style, but particularly craft-brewed versions of classic lagers. Let RAR North Star Pils guide your craft by visiting bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact them at 1-800-374-2739. Before we start talking here, I do want to mention that it is now kind of early August, and the deadline for Craft Beer and Brewing's Best in Beer issue submissions from breweries, if you are a professional brewer out there, that deadline is August 28th. So if you are not on our emailing list and our editorial list for receiving notifications about that, just drop me an email, jbogner, J-B-O-G-N-E-R, at beerandbrewing.com. I'd be happy to send you a link to the list, or go onto the help center at beerandbrewing.com. Look up how to submit beer for review of Craft Beer and Brewing, and do that. The Best in Beer issue is obviously the biggest one of the year, and we are madly prepping for that right now. And we want to kind of course, cast a wide net, especially in these days when it's hard for us to get. I look at it in a typical year, I would have been traveling pretty much nonstop twice a month for the last 6 months. And these days, for the last 6 months, I have traveled between my living room down into my office basement, and every once in a while to the office. Not very often, but to get a package or two. And so anyway, our opportunity for experiencing and enjoying and embracing the beer that professional brewers are making right now and around the world has been more limited than it would typically be in a year. We would love to, again, cast that net as wide as possible. So, just shoot me an email. And Tropes. Let's talk about your brewing history, how you got to where you are today at Resonant Culture, follow that kind of arc for your professional career from the point where you started engaging with craft beer to the time you decided that this needed to be a career, and then, how you got to Resonant Culture today.
Yeah, I guess the kind of introduction to craft beer probably happened on my wife and I took a trip, my girlfriend at the time, wife now, to Europe after we graduated, and stopped in Belgium along the way, and was really impacted by our trip to Brussels. We went to this little beer bar that I'm forgetting the name of right now, that's right by the Mannequin Peace, the little boy like peeing into the fountain. But I had a Zinna beer by Brasserie de la Seine, and it just blew me away. And I hadn't had anything like it. Not to mention all the other beers we had when we were in Belgium, where I was not only was the beer so good, but I was blown away by how you would go into a beer bar in Belgium and they'd have a list of 300 different types of beers, and you'd order the beer and they would come out with like the specialized glass just for that brand of beer, and what they bring you the bottle, and it was just clear that they were really taking their beer much more seriously than obviously I was at the time, or probably most of the United States even. And that just really struck me and kind of left a lasting impression. Obviously, we kept the menu from that was in 2009, so it's been a while. But when I got back to the States, I definitely kind of branched out in my beer drinking. Some of my roommates were home brewers at the time. I was in Houston, Texas, and then quickly followed my wife to Austin, Texas, and kind of started homebrewing on a more serious level. And pretty soon after, had the classic dream of starting my own brewery someday. And from there, I made it a point to kind of get some real firsthand experience. Which was really a smart decision. I know there's lots of people that kind of jump right in to the professional realm straight from home brewing and crush it, but I just wasn't in a position to do that financially or really, from a skill set point of view. So yeah, I basically just started volunteering at a brewery called Independence Brewing Company in Austin. Great guys, they make some great beer. It was a really fun and interesting place to learn because when I started there, gosh, I forget what year that was, probably 2012 or so, 2013. They were working on a super old 15 barrel system. Like, there were no slope floors in that place. We had to squeegee the entire floor every single night. I was working on a 4-head bottling Mahine for 8 to 10 hours a day, and like we were just scraping by, and we learned a lot about what not to do, but at the end of the day we still made really great beer on maybe not ideal equipment. And then of course they grew quite a bit while I was there into this 60 barrel brew house, and they upgraded all their equipment, and now I think they're kind of partially owned by Lagunitas and they're crushing it. But I kind of got to see that whole trajectory, so I learned a lot there and worked my way up from the bottling line to a cellar position, and then kind of just on a whim applied to I guess Russian River had posted I think it was a pro brewer ad, and at the time I wasn't even really looking for work, but Russian River being who they were, and my wife and I had visited there a couple of years prior, before I was even in the industry, and they were easily my favorite brewery that I had ever had. So I figured, why not apply? What could possibly, there's no downside to that. And lo and behold, I guess Vinny liked my cover letter and brought me out for an interview, and it went well, and I got the job. So we moved halfway across the country again to go to Northern California, and I started out in a cellar position, and quickly there was a little turnover when I was there, and they needed me to move into a brewer position pretty soon after I started, which was great. A little nerve-wracking, to be brewing Pliny the Elder on your first professional brew, only 3 months after being hired to do a cellar job, but it was a great learning experience, and they really treat their employees great there. I can't really say enough good things about them, but obviously, learning how to brew the best beer in the world was huge for me and kind of opened some doors. I feel, on one hand, I feel kind of bad for Natalie and Vinny because I think they lose a lot of good talent. Not that I was good talent, but they lose a lot of other good talent. I think strictly based on the reputation that they have, and they probably see more turnover than
they become a target
because
for other brewers to poach from.
I think so. Yeah, which is too bad. They really do treat their employees well. I mean, it was great. We got free lunches. The pay was great, and benefits were great. And they're just good people. So I felt bad leaving, and it wasn't at all intended. But I had the opportunity to kind of pursue my original dream of opening my own brewery. I was approached. A friend of a friend approached me, and it was a really good opportunity to move back to North Carolina, where I went to school with my wife, and I have some family out here, and I, got full control over the brewing operations and a little equity stake, and we didn't have to risk a whole lot. So it was kind of a no-brainer. And then, that was what, 4 years ago. The brewery's 3 years old, and here we are today.
Let's shift gears here a little bit. Before we do that, with nearly 20 years of innovation experience, Brewmation specializes in electric, steam, and direct fire brewhouses, complete cellar solutions, and automated controls for the craft brewing industry. From half barrel to 30 barrel systems, Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs and brewing style. Whether you're starting a new brewery, upgrading your cellar, or just need some parts to keep you up and running, Brewmation has you covered. Visit them at brewmation.com to get started. Also, Grandstand is your source for the latest trends in branded drinkware, apparel, and promotional items. They make your job easy by serving as your one-stop shop for everything you need to outfit your taproom and fans. Current trends include to-go drinkware, tie-dyed prints, and portable coolers. Visit egrandstand.com/lookbook to see what's trending. So, talk to me a little bit about resident culture and the idea behind the brewery, from a kind of creative aspect and standpoint.
Yeah, I think, a lot of brewers say that they just want to make beer that they want to drink, and that was mostly true for me. I definitely wanted to have a focus on hoppy styles, lagers, and mixed culture beers. One thing I really enjoyed when I was at Russian River was being able to brew the Sinambic, which is the base beer for beatification. Their quasi spontaneous beer. As the pub brewer, they have the little horny tank in the pub, so I got to brew that beer, and that really made an impression on me. And just kind of this, I mean, the name resident culture is meant to kind of evoke the house yeast culture, and we really wanted that to be a part of our mixed culture program and hopefully develop something that was unique. And what better way to do that than spontaneous beer? So we decided to put in a cool ship, which was, I think at the time, the first or second in North Carolina. So, that obviously works from a marketing perspective as well, but no one was really doing it at the time, and we wanted to see what we could produce in our locality from a spontaneous perspective. But mostly it's beers that we wanted to drink ourselves. But also we had to be realistic about running a business, and I'm not naive, and I know that especially now is the perfect time, perfect example of having to do things you weren't intending to originally and change your business plan up. But I certainly see a place for kind of all styles of beer, especially the ones that are popular, even if they might not be the ones that I want to drink every day.
Sure, sure. And with something like spontaneous beer, you can't expect necessarily a audience demand to be there for something that has a relatively kind of niche approach and a niche audience right now in North America, actually, or worldwide for that matter. But there is something that I would, having been to the tap room, having seen the cool ship room, there is something about creating a drama and romance to the idea of it in a visual and kind of experiential way, so that even people, when they walk into your brewery and they see it there, or if they happen to be there on a day when you are filling a cool ship, it the kind of the visual experience of it is something that builds an incredible excitement around that kind of beer itself. And so in a lot of ways, you're almost setting out to create an audience for the beer as much as you are sell a beer to an existing audience for that kind of beer.
Yeah, that's, I mean, you said it better than I could have, honestly. And now that you say that, that's interesting. I remember that you were there for one of the fillings, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
we don't get to fill it very often in North Carolina. We only have, you know, the stars have to align with the weather and having barrels available to put it into and all that. So I think we've only filled it maybe 7 or 8 times in our whole history. So you were lucky to be there for one of those days.
It was the end of January in 2019 when we were out there, and yeah, yeah. So then
Yeah.
moving into a market like Charlotte with this kind of idea that you want to make both interesting and kind of beers that are pushing the conversation forward and on that kind of progressive edge of IPA, sour beer, mixed culture beer. Um, how'd you form this kind of foundation of recipes and then start to kind of envision what the character of resident culture was going to feel like?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll be the first to admit it wasn't at all what I thought it was going to be when I, left California and was all about, West Coast IPA and
Sure.
light, dry, crisp, bitter beers for the most part. We've definitely had to adapt to our market and what our consumers wanted, which was, I mean, it's a little scary and also fun in a way because I'm having to really throw a bunch of ideas at the wall sometimes and try to see what works best. It's not necessarily what I was trained as a brewer to brew, So we, quickly realized, for example, that the West Coast IPAs weren't exactly what our market was craving. They do okay, but uh, there was no one really canning beer and having releases and with the branding that we kind of brought to the table, we kind of put it all together for everyone and into one package. Um, and it really just caught on quickly. And I'll admit, a lot of the hazy, well, even still to this day, a lot of the IPAs we make are not all hits. They missed a lot of the time, and we really had to adapt to our system and figure out what worked for us. And that just, I think, really requires a lot of honesty and you got to kind of put your ego aside quite a bit and just like really honestly taste the beers and try to determine what went wrong and how to fix it. I think that we just dumped a beer last week, for example, which we don't thankfully have to do that very often, but sometimes you just got to do that. And at the beginning of our brewery, we certainly did that quite a bit more.
So when you say not a hit, what are some of the kind of parameters that you find go in different directions, go in the wrong direction for you that kind of create, or push a beer to a point where it doesn't meet the vision that you had for it or that expectation?
Yeah, there's a lot of, it's tough. I mean, there's a lot of borderline beers that would 95% of breweries sell it, uh, and would, some people enjoy it and would some people not? Yeah. And you have long conversations about those ones.
Well, let me phrase it a little differently. When you're tasting a beer, what is it that might push it, or what kind of common things do you find in those beers that don't meet your standard? What is it that will disqualify a beer for you? And, once we talk about what those things are, let's dig in a little bit further to think about what in the process creates those and how you then solve for some of those issues.
Yeah, for sure. I think specifically with regards to IPAs, I'm mostly talking about IPAs here for the
Sure.
record. Uh, there are a few things that really are prevalent more frequently than others. I think one of them is the kind of harsh astringency factor that is pretty common. It seems like in the hazy IPAs especially. We've just had some that were so astringent and unpleasant to drink that we had to cut the cord on them. I mean, at the end of the day, if the beer isn't drinkable, then what do you do? What's the point?
Sure. And this astringency, is this driven by hops, the choice of specific hops, the way that those blend of hops are working together? Was it based on like extraction time, temperature, or other type of process concern? You know, as you kind of delve into this, where is that astringency coming from, or have you been able to kind of identify to prevent it from happening again?
Yeah, I think you kind of hit on all of the different factors that go into it. I think it's a combination of the body of the beer. We much more frequently see it in beers that have finished at a dry final gravity. So yeah, from that point of view, we try, especially on these beers that are hopped at 3, 4, 5 pounds per barrel, we try to ensure that we're going to have a lot of body in the beer, so higher mash temps. We try to avoid putting lactose or maltodextrin into a beer. Occasionally we will if we're doing like a session IPA or a lighter bodied beer. Just we've learned that does help. And then, there are certain hops that do cause more astringency than others. Actually, this one that we're going to dump, which I'm happy to talk about because I think more breweries need to dump beer more frequently. But it was 100% Galaxy beer, and I think we just got a bad batch of Galaxy. We've since changed lots that we're getting, and I've actually tasted it in some other Galaxy beers that I've had, so it makes me feel a little bit better about our situation, like that it wasn't a process related thing, because otherwise I had no idea why it created that flavor. We've seen it in some other hops too. If they're just not good quality hops, then they will impart some bad flavors, astringency being one of them. Yeah, I think I kind of touched on it, these super high hop loads are a huge factor too. And breweries are trying to turn them around so fast sometimes that it doesn't really give them enough time to clear out and brighten up. So I think having enough residency in the bright tank or just crashing in the fermenter for an ample amount of time is helpful. I mean, you hear people talking about that all the time, like, let this can sit for a couple weeks before you drink it and it'll be much better. And I totally get why a brewery needs to put that out, and I'm not trying to criticize that. We certainly try to turn beer as fast as we can, but sometimes a little extra time crashing in a fermenter or bright tank can make a big difference.
Do you use things like dry hopping temperature to your advantage to try to bring down some of that astringency?
Yeah, so for quite a while, actually, maybe 2 years, we were dry hopping, doing a soft crash. So we would fully ferment the beer out, soft crash to about 60 degrees Fahrenheit, try to drop as much yeast out as possible, and then dry hop with a recirc the next day. And that worked pretty well for us. But we kind of had a few instances where the beers were turning out really vegetal and then also pretty astringent. And we couldn't quite put our finger on it. Lo and behold, we've done some research kind of with YCH and with some friends. Oh shoot, I should mention that one of the other things that came of this cooler dry hop was this like hop stank. I don't want to get too far off the astringency question, but
hop stank.
Yeah, this like some brewers will describe it as like an overripe, like papaya, like stinky, overripe fruit. And ironically, I think a decent amount of consumers like it just because it's a really aggressive aroma, and it kind of pops out of the glass. And I think in small amounts it is actually kind of pleasant, kind of contributes to that kind of like dank, sweaty hoppiness. But it can really get out of hand. And I think we worked with YCH and then some brewing friends to kind of try to pinpoint exactly what was happening. And we don't have a definite answer at this point, but after they analyzed a bunch of beers for us, at this point we kind of believe that it has to do with the cooler dry hop that we were doing. We think that we're going to try avoid it in the future by using a warmer dry hop, getting some biotransformation, so dry hopping with yeast still in suspension and still active. So far, it's been working for us. So we're kind of making that an SOP moving forward. So we've kind of abandoned the cool dry hop. I think that the cool dry hop works really well if you have great hops and you're sure that they're going to, produce a really good beer. But if you're ever unsure, we found that a little bit of active, firm dry hopping can really transform hops that might not really speak to you out of the bag. And the final product, it always seems to work out a lot better. It's just kind of an insurance policy against hops that you might not be 100% on. And that's proven true for us, at least. I can only speak to the results we've seen. But the lab guys at YCH, that was kind of their hypothesis. They don't have any like hard facts to back that up, but so far it seems anecdotally true for us. So we're kind of moving over to that fully for all of our IPAs.
It's an interesting idea that that biotransformation process could, because it tends to generate using specific yeast. And I assume you're using London Ale 3 or
Yeah, we kind of vary between BSI's London Ale
sure.
3 and Omega's London Ale 3, but all pretty similar strains.
Yeah. But using that kind of yeast strain, it's going to, convert and create these flavor compounds that we generally find pleasant and enjoyable. But I haven't heard brewers talk before about that idea that it could take hops that you are less thrilled about, or have a lower bag appeal, and kind of turn them into something that you're a little bit happier with. And the hop stank idea I think is interesting. Certainly, as we went through our IPA issue, I find that to be a nice complement to the kind of more simplistic and straightforward citrus characters that are so prevalent, especially in Citra beers. That having something that is just sweet and fruity is okay, but having something that is sweet and fruity with some interesting and funky edges, whether that's a minerality or whether that's that kind of, locker room sweat, or whether that's, like you say, that kind of overripe papaya, guava, stinky, almost like edge of rotting kind of tropical fruit, in small amounts adds these nice edges and creates some definition, especially in beers that are so big, full bodied, and just generally sweet and fruity. But riding that line is hard. How do you kind of envision from a recipe and process perspective how you are going to accomplish those kinds of multi-layered, multi-dimensional elements within your hazy IPAs?
It's interesting that you say that. I agree, and I think that it's of course, as a professional brewer, we have to think about what the consumer is after, and it seems like sometimes they just want like really sweet, full-bodied, fruity beers, like you said. And I wonder sometimes if the nuance of like having a little of that interesting funk, if you will, the little dank characteristics, sometimes gets lost. But then again, they're also pretty highly rated beers for us. So I think the consumers get that too, and which is nice to see. But yeah, when we're constructing an IPA recipe, we're lucky enough to select our own hops, which has really been a game changer for us. So we kind of have a good idea of what each hop is bringing to the table. At least the Citra, Mosaic, Galaxy. We use a lot of Strata. We really like, and we also actually use a lot of this experimental hop HBC 692 and Sabro. So we kind of know what each of those hops is bringing to the table for the most part, and we can kind of layer them as we want. And I'm with you. I think there's kind of a need for that kind of piney, almost dank characteristic in a beer, so that it's not just like overly sweet and fruity. I think it makes it a little more palatable over, having a couple beers.
What I find interesting too is that, when I look at the way that our blind panel responds to them, and I look at the way, having again tasted through all of these in a big blind tasting, it's remarkable to me when, tasting something like a monkish, hazy IPA, just how bitter and dank and funky the elements are within that beer, more so than I would necessarily get if I were just drinking that beer or that family of beers from that brewery by itself. And same kind of thing with New Anthem and these other kind of top IPA, hazy IPA purveyors. I think that they work on multiple levels, and I think that's the weird and interesting thing about it, to where some consumers can taste them and not taste that part of it, or maybe not consciously process that they are tasting that part of it, and would describe it, if you ask them, as straight juice. Oh, it's just like straight fruit juice. But the reality is, even when you drink orange juice, it's not like straight orange flavoring. Like, there is, it is actually right. There are these other characters within even orange juice itself. It has its own kind of like astringent bitterness even within it. In addition to all of the sugar, in addition to the kind of sweet orange flavor in orange juice itself, it has these other undercurrents, and I think that becomes this interesting challenge where I do see consumers responding to that. I don't know that they necessarily know why that they're responding to it. But those beers, then, when you have, even when our judges tasting within this giant context, and you come across something like that both captures that sweet and juicy character and has these interesting layered undertones to it that make it a deep and engaging beverage just as a beverage, then that's also a fascinating experience to see something that, it's like a piece of art where an audience that is not as versed in the kind of subtext and, and deep meaning could look at it and think, oh, well, that's really cool. And, a critic could also pull up a seat and speak to, the volumes of additional things that are going on that may not be, immediately available. I love things that work on both of those levels, that kind of play on that. But that being aside, sorry, I'm off on my, my creative tangent there. From your perspective, envisioning something like that becomes an interesting challenge, and then using the tools again from mash to hopping regimen to kind of process tweaks through the brewing process. How do you go through that optimization process and figure, like, well, this one is super sweet. How do I tweak an edge to that to kind of keep it sweet, but also add this kind of fun element that I think may help bring it out? Or another way to think about it is, adding salt, to caramel brings out the sweetness, even though it's a different kind of, it creates this counterpoint, which actually heightens the experience of this other thing. Within that IPA recipe, how do you think about, like, if I throw a little bit of this in, it's going to make this other thing pop a little bit more. Talk to me a little bit about that kind of creative process from your perspective.
Yeah. Well, we actually do add salt, a decent amount of salt to our hoppy beers, which is interesting.
Okay.
I actually do think that kind of helps soften the mouthfeel of it a little bit. It's not to a perceivable level, like it's not tasting salty, I hope.
Right.
Not to my palate, but I do think it helps our water chemistry to help, make those beers a little softer. But yeah, this kind of goes back to you really just have to have a good or an honest palate, and you have to taste the beers that you're brewing and be honest about the flavors that you're getting. But yeah, from the point of view of designing a recipe, uh, we'll use the body of the beer to help us, use bigger dry hops, for example. The higher alcohol content creates more body, perceived sweetness, and body. So you can hop those beers a little heavier. If it's not going to be as high in alcohol, then you need body in other ways, a higher mash temp or unfermentable sugars. If you got, like I said earlier, if you have hops that aren't going to be outstanding, on their own, they might require a little bit of biotransformation to help kind of smooth out their flavors a little bit. There's certain hops that don't really work well just on their own, just because they're not super punchy and strong by themselves, but they work really well in tandem with other hops, Azaka and Motueka, and there's a number of lower alpha hops that are just kind of, they're beautiful, but if you try to use them by themselves, it won't really hit as hard. Those are all kind of things we consider, and a lot of it's just through trial and error. I'll be honest. We change our recipes and our processes up constantly. I mean, we're only a 3-year-old brewery. I still don't feel like we're, I still feel like we're still trying to figure ourselves out, and our processes out, and we're changing things all the time. And I don't think we'll be there for at least another year where I feel really, really confident in all of our processes and all of our beer consistency. I think it's just an ongoing thing. You really gotta experiment and be honest with yourself about the beer that you're making, and that's the only way to get better.
Now, I've heard you say it a few times. Be honest with yourself, and now, well, it's another interesting and kind of fascinating question that I always have for breweries, that it is natural within any kind of brewery or business or anything along those lines to be familiar with what you do and also be conditioned by what you do. That over time, our contexts and our palates become created and tuned to the things that we consume most often. There's not some, outside ideal of what everything should be like. We are products, and our very palates are products of our own environment and the own inputs that we put, that we feed them. And so, when it comes to breweries, I for years I've been remarking on this, but breweries that give all of their staff free beer from the brewery, it's a really cool idea. It's a great initiative. But what happens is that everyone at the brewery's palate becomes tuned in to the flavors that brewery makes. And so then your appraisal of what is good becomes defined by the beer that you make as your brewery. And as a result, then brewers, and I hear it relatively frequently, well, on our internal panel, we tasted, this beer, our beer, along with these beers from these other folks, and our entire panel, liked our beer better. And so every time I hear that from a brewer, I'm like, yeah, of course they do, right? I mean, it's like, because everyone is drinking that beer all the time, that is what they begin to associate with good. And because they associate that with good, everything else gets judged against that. Like, it becomes a very hard process as a brewer, as a brewery operator, as someone even working within staff to all taste, and appraise and evaluate beer in a broader sense. If you're only tasting yours, or you're primarily tasting your own, it can be hard to look at it from the same standpoint as a consumer who is not just drinking your beer, but is now drinking your beer plus your local competitors, plus beer from farther afield that they're trading for with friends, whether it's close or across the country, and have a different palate for this. From your perspective, then, how are you honest with yourself, but building a a level of appraisal and understanding of what that isn't just conditioned by what you personally like and what you drink a lot, but also has some broader idea of honesty being the way that a consumer is going to approach this?
Yeah, good question. And like that this about me, that I'm kind of my harshest critic, and I'll be the first one to criticize the beers that I make. But I really, I think I am.
You always say that before you defend it in some way or another. But yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'll defend that. You really got to be critical of yourself if you're going to be a good brewer. But besides that, I truly do drink a lot of other people's beer, more so than I drink my own, even. I'm drinking a Cellar Maker Pale Ale right now that they were nice enough to send me. And when we're also very fortunate that people bring in a lot of beer to the brewery. Well, they used to when we were open more frequently. We have a lot of customers that are beer nerds, and they'll have beer shares at the brewery and drop some cool cans or bottles off for us to try. And a lot of breweries will visit and drop beer off, and I'm always excited to try what other people are bringing into the brewery and what our customers specifically are drinking and are excited about. And sure, it might be a 18% imperial stout that I'm not particularly fond of drinking most of the time, but I'll go over and have a little pour of it and see what they're getting excited about, and try to really think about, how I could recreate that, or if that's something I want to recreate, because clearly, they're excited about it. So there's some value there. But yeah, I think it's all about tasting not just other beer, but wine. I drink a lot of wine, and I'm trying to get a lot better about analyzing the flavors and the experience, the drinking experience that we're having with the wine that we're drinking, and food, being a little more thoughtful about, your palate and just everything that you're kind of taking in. It all kind of comes back to beer in some way, and you can relate it all together. But I think you make a pretty good point when you're drinking, one thing all the time. It's easy to kind of cloud your own judgment and opinion.
Tropes, let's talk a little bit about quick sour methods, or I should say at least the kind of Berliner Gose family of beers. But first, Abe Beverage Equipment is your trusted source for complete brewing and packaging solutions. Whether you're just starting out or looking to expand, Abe offers brew houses from 3 to 60 barrel and canning lines from 15 to 90 cans per minute. Call Abe Beverage Equipment at 402-475-BEER or visit abeequipment.com to learn more. Located in Lincoln, Nebraska, Abe is your trusted source for your brewing equipment. Visit Abe Equipment, that's ABE equipment.com, for complete brewery solutions. Also, Craft Beer and Brewing's All Access subscriptions give you a year of the print and digital editions of the magazine, plus access to our library of video courses, including those with Chris Tropeano here, a special deep dive email only for All Access subscribers, premium content, and All Access exclusive merchandise. Go to beerandbrewing.com and click on the subscribe button to join now. You taught a video class for us on this, and about building kind of quicker but acid forward beers and fruit and acid combination beers. But lately you found your process kind of moving in a slightly different direction. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, we love kettle sours. We still brew them quite frequently. They're one of our most popular styles, probably right after IPAs are obviously our most popular. Then it's kind of even between kettle sours and lagers. But They're a great base for fruit, and a nice refreshing drink. We just kind of, from a creative perspective, they're not super nuanced or complex beers, um, and we just hired a guy, David, out of Atlanta, who has a pretty good background in kind of mixed culture stuff and Berliners in particular, and he's kind of spearheading this program for us. And the beers. So but what we're doing now, we're moving towards uh, mixed culture, kind of more traditional Berliners. The base is no boil, um, but we have a Solera going in a stainless tank. So there's an option to change that in the future where we can boil the base beer and add that to the main Solera and kind of change the base beer over time. But the idea is to kind of have a mixed culture that's not overly funky or overly acidic, just kind of a nice base that's a little more interesting than your typical kettle sour, which is just really clean, tart, and simple. And for us, it's been a really nice way to utilize. Right now, it's summer season, so we have tons of local fruit in North Carolina, and we've been really fortunate this year. We've been overloaded with fruit, really, just because it all seems to come in season at the same time. But this base beer kind of does a little more justice for us for the local fruit that we're getting, and the end product is just a little more nuanced and subtle and a little more complex and a little more pleasant to drink from our perspective. So we're at the current moment we're doing 4 packs of 330 ml bottles, and everything is bottle conditioned with like a quasi krausening method. So the head retention on the beer is great, which is something you don't get with kettle soured beers, and something that means a lot to me as a brewer. And I don't know how much the consumers really care about that, but it's really satisfying to crack a bottle of Berliner and have a super frothy head that kind of lingers on the glass. And you just can't get that with forced carbs kettle sours. But yeah, the beers themselves they're just a little more interesting to drink, and I would really love if we could maybe not completely eliminate kettle sours. I think there's a place for them, and they're so easy to make and such a quick turnaround that they'll probably always be a part of our arsenal. But this is just kind of another tool in the toolbox, and kind of scratches an itch for the brewer specifically. And I hope the consumers kind of can appreciate the added complexity and nuance of the beer. But yeah, we're really enjoying them, and we hope they catch on, and we can kind of promote this like 4-pack at a pretty reasonable price point, because it's all stainless, fermented. It's not a super long beer. It's probably a 1 to 2 month turnaround time, as opposed to like a 2-week turnaround time with a kettle sour. So it's nothing like a barrel aged mixed culture beer that's taking a year, but
Right.
it takes a little bit more time and effort than your typical kettle sour.
Quick fermentations, quick lactic fermentations in these kinds of quick sour beers are pretty easy to understand. Crank up at the temperature, pitch a pure lactic culture, get it to the level of TA or pH that you have for a goal. Cut it off, and kind of move through the process. But when you start talking about building a Solera method with a culture that is not just a purely lactic culture potentially, then time and temperature and oxygen and everything else become some significant factors to kind of maintain through that. Also making sure that that culture stays where you want it to be and doesn't drift with other kinds of elements of the culture kind of coming to the forefront. Talk to me a little bit about, and with that kind of method, keeping that culture, developing these kinds of, Berliner Gose type light but acidic flavors without producing kind of negative or off flavors.
Yeah, good question. We we basically use we actually use for the lacto culture. So it's the overall culture is a combination of lactobacillus, a couple lactobacillus strains and Brettanomyces strains. It's unclear whether there's any sac in there at this point. It's possible that some may have snuck in there, but it started as just Brett and lacto. But we're kind of using a combination of our hopping rates, IBUs in the kettle to control the lacto. The lacto that we have is pretty hop sensitive, which works in our favor a little bit, but also we have to be careful how highly we're hopping it. So really just a couple IBUs is enough to keep it to a point where we know it's not going to over sour anything. When we're knocking the beer out, we typically will go on the warmer side, 85, sometimes 90 degrees Fahrenheit, just to give the lacto a little bit of a head start. And we're also not aerating the beer. So that kind of all helps to give the lacto a little bit of an advantage over the yeast that might be in there. And the Brett, I mean, Brett is a yeast, but yeah, and again, we're not looking for a super funky Brettanomyces like funk bomb from these
Sure.
beers. We want them to have character and, like I said, nuance, but be really palatable. And at the end of the day, a Berliner Weiss, in my mind, should be a crushable, refreshing beer. And that's essentially still what we're after with these beers. So dialing in that level of tartness is really important. We've blended down to where we want to be. We've gotten the base beer to a point where it's like a pretty good acidity. We're actually at this point, we're looking for a little more acidity out of our base beer. So for example, this last time we topped up the Solera, we put 0 IBU wort in there, knocked it out at 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and actually added a fresh pitch of lacto to it to kind of give a little bit more of a head start to the lacto, because I think we had just gone a little bit too heavy on the IBUs from previous batches, and it just needed a little bit more acidity. But yeah, we're really just at the end of the day hoping that this beer can be really refreshing and drinkable, and we want it to be, something that's not too complicated from a brewing perspective.
Sure.
Because we do want it to be a quicker turnaround in terms of quicker compared to other mixed culture beers, but still have a little bit of flavor and complexity to it.
So how large is the tank relative to a typical batch size coming off of your system? How much are you pulling off, and then how much do you put back in? Is that always a 1-to-1 where you're doing a specific size batch, you take that much off, package that out to become whatever beer that's going to become, or put it onto whatever fruit or however you want to treat that? What does that kind of mechanical process look like?
Yeah, it does depend on the fruit. So far, we've only fruited the variants that we've done. We've thought about just kind of dry hopping a version and serving it straight up, but for the time being, it revolves a lot around the fruit availability. So we've done strawberries. We did a strawberry beer, and we kind of determined the amount that we're going to pull off based on the amount of strawberries that we had, or whatever the fruit may be. We did blueberries most recently. So that kind of determines how much we're pulling off, and then the amount that we pull off, we're typically putting back in whatever we pull off. The vessel itself is a little over 10 barrels, I believe, and our system is 15 barrels. So what we typically do is we'll just pull off wort from a double batch of another beer. So we're pulling it off of like a 30 barrel batch of lager or Berliner Weiss, like a kettle sour. Berliner Weiss. Well, I'm getting confusing now, but we make a very clear distinction between kettle souring and Berliners. We don't call any of our kettle sours Berliner Weiss, so I shouldn't say that. Like our cans will never say Berliner Weiss on them, but the bottles do, just so that our consumers know like exactly what they're getting. But yeah, those recipes are the base recipes are very similar. So we will pull off wort from those into the Solera, and then the rest of it will go into our normal fermenter for fermentation.
That makes sense. Let's pivot again, and because I know that you'd love to talk about lager brewing for a while, given that that's just one of those kind of passions that is also driven and supported by some of the other beers that you play with, also. But you all launched a Lager Fest last year, and yeah, have definitely been trying to push the lager narrative forward. What I really am curious about is how you approach making lagers that feel like your beer and that have a resident culture character to them. So, talk to me a little bit about designing and brewing lager beer that maintains personality and some sort of identifiable characteristics for you in the brewery, while also fitting within this bigger tradition of lager brewing and feeling like what the expectation, tasting like what that expectation is for lager beer.
Yeah, I'm obviously we're huge fans of lager at Resident Culture, and that's probably the beer that I care most about personally, as the head brewer, and so I really dedicate a lot of time and effort to dialing those in and kind of developing kind of our process, both our process and kind of the vision we see for that program moving forward, and kind of from a big picture. And I really, again, at the end of the day, these beers need to be drinkable and crushable, in my opinion. But we want them to have nuance and character. And I think when it comes to lagers, really little things can make a big difference because the flavors are so delicate. So for us, specifically, one thing we're doing recently that we've kind of developed and we've found has made a really big difference for the quality of our beer is krausening our lagers, which is a pretty traditional German technique of taking some actively fermenting wort from another batch of lager and pushing it into a finished lager that is finished fermenting, and you kind of naturally carbonate the lager that way, and it also polishes up a lot of the flavors. We've also found that it creates some really incredible head retention that we haven't even been able to attain with spunding, which is another process that we previously used quite a bit. And that's just a method of kind of capping a tank before a beer is done fully fermenting and capturing that natural carbonation or natural CO2 that would normally blow off. And that is a good way to create head retention, but not it for us. Anecdotally, it hasn't been as good as this krausening method, and the krausening has really, it seems to really just like polish off the edges of the beer and make it a really soft, delicate, really nuanced beer. And we're trying to move over all of our lagers to this method. It requires a little bit of juggling from a production standpoint, because you need to have a lager that's done fermenting just as soon as you have another lager that's at high krausen, which is like the most active part of fermentation. But we've got ourselves in a pretty good place where we feel like we can do it consistently. There's some small exceptions to that, but yeah, that's one thing that's really recently kind of been eye-opening for us. Other than that, we were lucky enough. Our friends at Halfway Crooks in Atlanta actually went to Germany last year to select hops straight from Seitz Farm in Germany, and they were generous enough to include us on their hop order. So um, basically 95% of the hops we're using in our German style pilsners are Helles, and then a lot of our other lagers that we make, even if they're just one-off, we'll utilize these hops that we get direct from Germany. It's just a small kind of family farm, um, and we've just been really impressed and delighted by the hops that we're getting from this German producer.
What was creating that kind of delight? From I mean, obviously we're talking about very small differences in a lot of ways here, but are there specific elements of these hops that you find again in small ways are like what makes them more enjoyable than say hops you would be using before them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure some of it is a placebo because I'm just like smitten with the romantic idea of getting hops straight from a small German farm. But the results have really borne that out. I mean, the last German pills we made, and we have a Helles coming down the pipeline, have been probably some of the best lagers we've made. And there's just this like really soft, nice, delicate floral thing that I think sometimes the German specific or the European hops that you get in the States have been processed in maybe not the best of ways, and they're changing hands multiple times. We've just seen a lot of European varieties that we get from other hop producers tend to be a little muddled and a little bit too herbal, and we get this like kind of weird. I can't really describe it in any other way other than like this cocoa powder thing, and I think that if you're able to source them direct from a farm, you're just kind of cutting out so many people in the process that you're probably getting a little bit of a better quality product. But yeah, they're just a little brighter, a little bit fresher, I guess, and the resulting beers just seem to be a little bit softer and a little bit more delicate and nuanced. And I don't know. Again, I'm probably just putting that in my own head because I think it's a sexy idea getting hops straight from Germany. But
Sure. Talk to me a little bit about the way you select malt, and then how you use malt in say Pilsner and Helles to kind of accomplish building a kind of character and a toothiness even in these very light beers.
yeah, that's funny. I mean, it's funny that you say that because we just kind of harping on what I was just talking about. We get this special malt from Germany from Epiphany. Epiphany is this local craft maltster in Durham, North Carolina, and they source this Ursprung Fest malt, which is only made once a year. They grow it, I believe it's just for Oktoberfest, obviously. Um, but it's one of my favorite malts we've ever brewed with. So whenever it's available, we buy at least a couple pallets of it. It's just got this. It's a Pilsner malt, but it's got a little bit more body and like a slightly darker color, and just this great crackery kind of biscuit quality that's just much more accentuated than your typical Pilsner malt. So again, there's probably a little bit of placebo happening there with me, but because it's coming straight from this one farm in Germany. But I think that the end product really kind of bores it out, and the beers that we've made with that malt have been really great. But yeah, for our typical pills, we are kind of suckers for Weirmann. I know a lot of brewers who are as well. There's just something about it, man. I don't know. We've used other malts as well, and had some pretty good success. But for a beer that especially a beer like Helles, which is pretty lightly hopped, it's really all about the malt character that you're getting, and you want something that's not going to produce a lot of DMS. You want something that's going to have a really nice biscuit kind of bready quality to it.
Right.
Um, and we've been able to find that with Environment products pretty consistently. And like I said, when we get this other malt from Germany, we kind of start using it in everything we can. So yeah, we just brewed our Fest beer and a Helles 100% with this malt, and we'll probably do a few more before it's out.
That's interesting. And so you'll switch the malt back to something else, even for something named in the same brand, and consumers don't have an expectation, and it'll be okay for them.
I mean, we kind of, it's kind of like if you got the product that's available, the best product available, use it and make the best beer you can. And there's going to be a little bit of variation, but I think it's worth it to get that, that one variation that might be a little bit better. And hopefully the consumers understand. Luckily, we're not a huge brewery, and our business model has had to change quite a bit, but I don't know that we have a lot of expectation around our brands, which is intentional. We've had to be a little bit more thoughtful about that now, because we're basically, with COVID now, a production brewery for the most part, and our beers are being sent all around. But we're still brewing so many different brands all the time that it's hard I think, for consumers to like compare directly one batch to a second batch. We brew them so infrequently, so I think that works in our advantage. But hopefully that doesn't hopefully that doesn't change now that we're a production brewery and might be brewing the same beers more frequently.
Sure. Well, we've been chatting for a while now, but one way that I'd love to end the podcast is talking to you about what success looks like for Resident Culture. When will you and Phil know that you have achieved it? What is that goal? Is there an end vision for what you hope to achieve? How far off would that be? And how do you define it?
Yeah, I guess if you had asked us that 4 months ago, we would probably have a different answer. I think right now we're just trying to weather the current storm and make sure that all of our employees are taken care of. And so for us right now, that means brewing as much beer as we can, as fast as we can. And we've obviously had to cut our margins quite a bit, and that's okay. We feel pretty fortunate compared to other people. So assuming we can kind of weather this storm, we truly have really shifted our thinking on everything, because we're probably going to continue the distribution footprint that we have, the drive-through service, the deliveries. They've been going pretty well in our area, so we kind of want to continue doing that even when we are able to reopen at full capacity. But our kind of goal from the beginning, even before all this happened, was to really kind of capitalize on the taproom model, which works in our favor in a lot of ways. The margins are better. It allows me some creative freedom to brew whatever beers I want to, and present them in their freshest form. We have a lot more control over the product, and we know, that we're serving something that tastes good, and we can control a lot more. So, I mean, we were literally in February, Philip, my partner, was maybe it sounds like I'm exaggerating, but we were about to sign a lease on a new location in Charlotte. And luckily we didn't. It would have been bad timing. I'm sure hopefully they would have been a little bit generous with us, but we've had to back off that. And it's still something that we absolutely are striving for longer term, is to find another location that we can create kind of a similar experience. Like I said, our current brewery is now a production brewery, so our former barrel room events room is completely taken over with grain and cans and bottles and storage, and like half of our tap room is also storage for the brewery, and we don't really foresee that changing anytime soon. So having a second tap room space would definitely be a priority of ours going forward, and that's just kind of the model that we like, with I guess probably a little bit of a bigger distribution footprint than we had originally envisioned, but it's been going pretty well, and I think the beer is moving fairly fast, which is good. But as long as I can kind of ensure that the quality is still good and the beer's moving in distro quickly, we'll probably keep that going.
No, this certainly pandemic COVID shutdown era has pushed us all to making the best of it, and understanding that even just making it is pretty good these days, rather than having grandiose dreams for giant successes or the next crazy creative project. Has it kind of focused your creative exploration a little bit? Do you find yourself playing in a narrower band, or has it, or are you taking advantage of, obviously because you have to sell beer in this specific way, which is putting it into cans that then, people buy at a specific size of a batch that's worth going through that kind of production, process with. Do you find yourself, brewing in a different kind of creative way, or how's it impacted that?
Yeah, for sure. We certainly can't get as funky as we probably were in the past. There's a few road blocks. For one, we have to be cognizant of our artist. We have an in-house artist, Marissa Pickett, who's incredible. But if we were brewing new beers every day, she would go insane, because she has to create a label from scratch for all of our beers now, because we're canning everything that we make. So which means that we're brewing a lot of brands that we have previously brewed that we have labels for, to kind of alleviate her workload. That likewise means that we can't necessarily brew a ton of 2.5% table beers that we would love to have on tap at the tap room and drink ourselves, but maybe don't necessarily sell all that well in a production setting.
Sure.
That doesn't mean that we won't brew them. We just did brew one recently, but that's, the exception, not the rule. So yeah, for sure we've had to kind of focus our efforts on the IPAs for sure. Luckily our lagers are still moving well, which that gives me a lot of hope for our world, the future of our world, that we can still sell lagers well. And we're just grateful to be where we're at and making it. I'm not going to complain about not being able to brew weird beers at a time like this.
Absolutely, for sure. Nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Set your compass by RAR North Star Pills. From half-barrel to 30-barrel systems, Brewmation puts you in control. Grandstand is your source for the latest trends in branded drinkware, apparel, and promotional items. Abe Beverage Equipment offers complete brewing and packaging solutions, and Craft Beer and Brewing's all-access subscriptions are the best way to support this very podcast. Tropes, if people want to learn more about Resident Culture, where do they find you guys?
Yeah, Instagram at Resident Culture, our website, residentculturebrewing.com. If you're in the Charlotte area, you can get beer delivered to your doorstep. And we're going to start trying to expand our distribution footprint around North Carolina a little bit more. Tavour, Tavour, we send quite a bit of beer to them, and that gets sent all around the country for the most part, right to your doorstep. So that's probably the best way to try our beer if you're not in North Carolina.
Cool. Well, Tropes, it was great talking with you, and wish you the best. Thanks for joining me on. Man. Thanks for joining me on the podcast. Cheers.
cheers. Thanks for having me.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.